This is the Jocko Unravelling Podcast, Episode 2, with Daryl Cooper and me, Jocko Willink. I know that the last episode, we wrapped up with a pretty harrowing account, and you kind of said, well, we'll move on to other things, but I got to keep us there for one more account here. It goes like this. Horror in Saddam's Iraq takes endless forms. In 1987-1988, Iraqi Air Force helicopters sprayed scores of Kurdish villages with a combination of chemical weapons, including mustard gas, sarin, and VX, a deadly nerve agent. Scores of thousands of Kurds, most of them women and children, died horrible deaths. Of those who survived, many were left blind or sterile or crippled with agonizing lung damage. But most of the Kurds slaughtered in that season of mass murder were not gassed but rounded up and gunned down into mass graves. Those victims were mostly men and boys, and their bodies have never been recovered. In one village near Kirkuk, after the males were taken to be killed, the women and small children were crammed into trucks and taken to a prison. One survivor, Salma Aziz Baban, described the ordeal to journalist Jeffrey Goldberg, who reported on Saddam's war against the Kurds in the New Yorker in March. More than 2,000 women and children were crammed into a room and given nothing to eat. When some starved to death, the Iraqi guards demanded that the body be passed to them through a window in the door. Aziz's 6-year-old son grew very sick. She says he knew he was dying. There was no medicine or doctor. He started to cry so much. He died in his mother's lap. I was screaming and crying, she told Goldberg. We gave them the body. It was passed outside, and the soldiers took it. Soon after, she pushed her way to the window to see if her child had been taken for burial. She saw 20 dogs roaming in the field where the dead bodies had been dumped. She said, I looked outside and saw the legs and hands of my son in the mouths of the dogs. The dogs were eating my son. Then I lost my mind. And that is from an article called Saddam's Shop of Horrors, written by Jeff Jacoby. And that was from the Boston Globe in 2002. So, that's 2002, right? It's not like we didn't know that this stuff was happening. Right? We didn't invade until 2003. This is 2002. We know what's going on in there. So, where does that kind of, where's that guy come from?
How much do you know about his origin story?
I know pretty decent amount.
I mean, it's a supervillain origin story in some ways.
Completely.
His father and brother die of cancer while his mother's pregnant. His mother is so depressed that she tries to abort Saddam, but he survives. And so she just abandons him, and he goes to stay with an uncle for a while. He eventually comes back to his mother after she remarries, but the stepfather just abuses him terribly, and so he flees and goes back. It's like, well, that's how you start. Those are the opening ingredients for how you get a guy like this. But I think it's important to remember too, like the stuff you're reading right there, all this stuff that happened. One guy does not do that. Yeah. One person cannot do that. Hitler can't commit the Holocaust by himself, and Saddam could not create that terror state all by himself either.
Yes. I'll tell you what, man. Leadership is the most important thing on the battlefield, and it's guys like Hitler and guys like Saddam. And man, they set the conditions. And then what's really scary is, as we see when atrocities take place, right? Sure, it's not that leader. It doesn't take much. It doesn't take much to lead people down this road. Like all the you want to throw it out there that people are, naturally benevolent and they're naturally, people want to help each other. I get it. And I know that is a thing that you can convince yourself of, and it's probably right in many cases, in the right conditions. You change those conditions, and it's not a stretch. It doesn't take as much as you would hope it takes to lead people down this path. That's the horrible truth, and that's why we have to be so aware of it. That's why we have to understand it. When we did the podcast on the My Lai massacre and the Sand Creek massacre, and we went through those. But when I did My Lai on my podcast, those were normal people. Yeah. That was a cross section of America. Not one of those. And I had this conversation with Jordan Peterson as well, which was, I had told an army group that they had sadists in their platoon. Like I said, listen, and they were looking at me, and I talk to people a lot. I can read a crowd, and they were looking at me as if I was, a little bit crazy and maybe just, trying to be extreme or whatever. And I'm looking back at them, and I'm thinking, they don't believe me right now. They don't believe me. They think I'm wrong, or they don't believe me, or this is just hyperbole. And no. And then so I said, "Oh, wait a second. You guys are looking at me like I don't know what I'm talking about here. Like you're going to be in a platoon." And this was actually young, officers on the way to being commissioned. So what is that? Officer candidates or cadets. And I said, "You're looking at me like I don't know what I'm talking about right now." And I said, let me ask you this: if I'm wrong, then how did My Lai unfold? How did that happen? If you've got a platoon or a company and there's 150 guys and there's no bad apples in there, how does that happen?
That one company just happened to get all the bad guys.
Every bad. Yeah. And when I actually drilled down a little bit with Jordan Peterson, and I said, hey, this is what I told these army guys. I told them in a platoon they got a sadist in there. Am I right? And I think I said murderer too, which I don't know how you draw that line, but he said, oh, how many people in the platoon? I said 40, and he goes, oh yeah, you're good, you're in, and especially because there's a whole chunk of civilization that just don't go in the military, right? And that chunk that just doesn't want to go in the military, almost none of them are sadists, right? Yeah. As soon as you're in the military, you have a higher percentage of, what are you signing up for? I'm signing up to shoot people and kill people. That's what I'm signing up to do. So there's a whole element that's already gone. So 1 out of 40, it's pretty nice, pretty generous. And so as we talk about this, it's like, yes, I get it that it wasn't all Saddam, clearly, but man, he absolutely set the conditions for this. Yeah. And that was the other interesting thing about the My Lai massacre, is that it was one officer, Thompson, who had flown in, saw what was happening, flew back to headquarters, said, these guys are murdering people. You need to stop it. And the commanding officer gets on the horn and says, hey, stop killing people. And they were like, okay, they stopped. Like instantly. Yeah. It's instantly. You wouldn't believe, if you saw that in a movie, you wouldn't believe it.
Like waking up from a dream.
You wouldn't believe it if you saw in a movie, oh, they just going to stop now? No, that's what happened. They got told no, and they stopped.
I wish I would have I read an account by a guy who was a member of ISIS, and he had done it all. Sex slavery, killing, everything. And he describes it as like waking up from a dream. He's in the middle of massacring a village, of an assault on a village, and he snaps out of it and goes, what am I doing? And he found his way out of it after that. And he talks about this stuff now. I'll bring some of that in tomorrow. And you wonder, like, okay, that's a guy who's capable of waking up and saying, what am I doing? That's the same guy he's raped, he has murdered children with conviction, doing it with conviction. We're complex creatures, and we're very adaptable creatures, and we can adapt to whatever environment we find ourselves in. And I think one of the things that, we have certain models that we use for thinking about other people's behavior. And we think about like the French resistance in Germany, right? Or the partisans out in the East when Germany overran them. We think, well, they didn't give up, right? They just kept fighting and they resisted the power. Okay, what if it's over? Hitler won, because that's what happened in Iraq. Hitler won. It's over. And now you've got to adapt yourself to that society, because nobody's coming to save you. Not until 2003 at least. I mean, that's it. And you got to figure out how to survive in a place where you don't just get killed for treason. You get killed because, somebody's having a paranoid attack, and that's it. Or somebody needs to send a message to a bunch of other people. It's got nothing to do with you. And you got to figure out how to navigate that. People can become very different creatures than they kind of naturally devolve into when they live in Vermont,
I've seen some pretty devolved creatures up in Vermont. Yeah, no, it's actually Vermont's probably a place where you wouldn't evolve. You'd get better. You become a better person up there in the woods, in the sticks. So let's go back to Saddam.
Yeah.
Where were we at?
Have you ever seen the video? It's an amazing video. The video when he at the Ba'athist meeting where he took power.
Yeah.
It is I tell everybody to watch it and watch him. Yeah. And so for the people who haven't seen it, there's like a 9-minute version out there. It kind of cuts it short. You can go see the thing. But he's taken over, right, from General Qasem, who was the guy before him. And he's taken power, and he calls all the Ba'athist party leaders and senior membership into this assembly hall. And there, some people are talking and everything. Saddam strides up, and you watch him, and he is just like either a great actor or what. He is confident. He is just striding up there with an arrogant pose. And he starts speaking about the traitors that are out there and all the people that are besetting the country of Iraq and the party and blah, blah, blah. And the people are like, yeah, okay. And he reaches down and just slowly pulls this big, long cigar out of his pocket and lights it. And he's out there on stage, and he starts smoking this cigar. And he just starts saying, if I call your name, stand up and go to the back of the room. And people are kind of start to look around at each other. He's planned all this, so he's having it filmed. And he knows who's going to be called. So, like, the camera will go to some of them sometimes. And as he's calling these names, people are kind of looking like, what is going on? They know what's going on, but they don't know what to do. And so they get up and they head to the back where the guards are. And finally, one guy stands up, and he says, wait, why did you call me? I didn't do anything. And Saddam just says, if I call your name, please stand up and go to the back with the guards. And the guy just goes back, and people go back. And people are starting to look at each other and realizing, like, what's happening here. And that these guys are being called back to go be executed. And then afterwards, he says a few words, and all of a sudden the people just break out, long live Saddam, long live Saddam. And they're all giving him like a big standing ovation. Because what else are you going to do in that situation, right? And, this is a guy who was in power for for almost 30 years, for 25 years. And he had a long, long period of time to find exactly the people to put into positions who were going to do exactly what he needed them to do to keep control of that society. And the rest of the people there had to figure out how to survive under that. I mean, from the moment Saddam takes power, he is at war, essentially. 1979, he takes power, and he's at war with Iran the next year. And it's a war that kind of gets lost today. A lot of people just slide right past it. I mean, it was probably the worst war in the second half of the 20th century in a lot of ways, at least the way it was fought.
For sure. Brutal.
Over 1 million killed. Devolving to a point where the two sides are just launching, ballistic missiles at each other's cities, just population centers indiscriminately, just launching them at each other, chemical weapons being used on population centers, purely to terrorize, to let people know that you better not rise up.
And at this point, Saddam's a pretty secular leader.
Yeah.
I mean, this isn't a guy that's out, touting Islam as the rule of law around Iraq.
He would stay that way till the 90s. Yeah. Yeah. The Ba'athist Party is a secular kind of socialist, pan-Arab nationalist party. And, that's why one of the things I think people really, really lose a little bit today is they think of like America and the Middle East, that we've just been over there pulling the strings like the puppet masters from all the way back, like from 1776 or something, that's what we've been doing. When, CENTCOM wasn't even stood up until 1983. The Iran-Iraq war had been going on for 3 years. This is 10 years after the oil crisis, and Central Command's not even stood up. And I remember after the USS Stark got hit, the frigate got hit by a cruise missile in 1987. Even in 1987, the response to that from a lot of the Navy brass was, why are we over there? What are we doing here? We were very much reacting to events, and we didn't know a lot about who these people were. When somebody like Saddam comes along, he seems like a secular nationalist type leader. He's got some worrying tendencies, but he's only been around a year. And meanwhile, we've got the Iranians over here who just took over with like an extreme Islamist revolution, overran our embassy, took a bunch of our people hostage, and are starting to act out in some pretty extreme ways. And so that's the context that Saddam comes into the picture. And all of a sudden, he wants to fight with Iran. And he's got a big Soviet army. The Iranians, unfortunately, have a pretty well-equipped military as well, because we were the Shah's, we were his friend before that. And so they took possession. We had just in the last few years before 1979 had sold him a bunch of F-15s and a bunch of just great aircraft. And it gave Saddam fits in the war because of that. But, I mean, they had a pretty well-equipped army. We had been equipping Iran as an ally for years. And now you have this revolutionary government.
Yeah, this is when you see the pictures of Iran in 1974, and the women are wearing miniskirts out in town, and it looks like a metropolitan Western country.
Yep. And it's one of the reasons that a lot of people get on my case, because I tend to give Saudi Arabia a little bit more of a break than a lot of people I know. And the reason I do it, though, is as opposed to a place like Iran, where Iran was a certain way, where women were free, and it was a relatively modern place. And then they had this revolution that said, nope, no more of that. And presumably a lot of those people who were enjoying their lives back in the day still live there, and now they have to live under this regressive, in this regressive manner. Saudi Arabia, however they look to us, obviously it's not acceptable, according to the way we do business. They're as liberal now as they've ever been. It's a slow, long project, but It's not like they were a certain way and then they got taken over by these crazy Islamists. And, Iran's not that way. Iran was a relatively free and open secular country, where women were free. And so all of a sudden you get this revolution. And the revolutionary part's important, right? Because it's not just a government that's kind of hostile now and maybe is doing things, passing laws, social laws and stuff that we don't like. It considers itself a revolutionary state, like the Soviet Union did. So it's not just an enemy country; it's a revolutionary movement, and they're eyeing the rest of the Muslim world. It's why they established Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's why now they're still trying to establish an Iraqi version of that, like to this day. It's built into their system, into their ideology, that this is an expansionist thing, that there's a larger project. So it doesn't just involve them. It involves the rest of the Muslim world. And so that's very worrying to us in 1979. They've still got our people, that they're holding captive from the embassy. Saddam comes along. He starts fighting with these people. And, of course, at first, we're kind of like, all right, maybe this guy's all right. Let's see how this plays out, right? He hasn't done all the things he's going to do yet. He's not a nice guy. We know that. But we don't have the whole story, and we kind of have some hope. And so we start out in the Iran-Iraq war, and we're kind of hoping that maybe he can, who knows, maybe create enough stress on the Iranian regime that they flip back over or something like that.
And you're also looking at the situation. You got a leader coming into power, and you don't really, like you said, he's bad, but you kind of think, well, he's stepping into power. He's going to want influence. He's going to need what we have. How can we how can we bring them along? How can we bring them onto our team?
Yeah, that was definitely the thinking. And, we didn't know who we were dealing with. We did not recognize the level of beast that we were dealing with Saddam. And I think by the end of the 80s, we had a pretty good idea that was the case, because we'd end up at war with them ourselves shortly after that. I mean, but the Iranians, again, like they seemed very dangerous at the time. This is a big country, large population, a well-equipped military, with an expansionist foreign policy. And when they were fighting Iraq, these are people who were sending human waves of teenagers across minefields to clear them with no weapons, just sending human waves of kids across minefields to clear them out. This was a regime that looked very, very dangerous, and they were dangerous. We just maybe we allowed ourselves to get sucked into some illusions about how controllable Saddam Hussein was. That's for sure. When I think there's a lot we don't know about the casualties in the Iran-Iraq war, but most estimates have it between 800,000 and 1 million people. It's a big war. It's a big conventional war. The Battle of Basra, toward the end of it, I think was the biggest battle since the Second World War, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe since one of the Korean War's battles. But I think 65,000 Iranians and 25,000 Iraqis were killed. I mean, it's a big battle.
That's a big battle.
In a set piece battle, where we're just not used to those kind of things anymore. There's a lot of trench warfare going on, and this is a war of attrition. I mean, literally, they're at the point toward the end where their manpower is depleted, and they're just launching Scuds at each other's cities, and it's a brutal thing. And that ends in 1988. Month before that is when USS Vincennes shot down that Iranian airliner. But as the Iranians now know from their recent experience, things happen.
Yeah, I brought that up. I was surprised it wasn't brought up more after this recent incident. And this is, again, when you start talking about the theme of having a thread tie back to the Vincennes shot down an Iranian airliner. However many souls were on board, hundreds, 150 or whatever that number is. Yeah, I mean, so it's a massive loss of life, and we actually very similar circumstances when you pick that apart. The Iranian shooting down the airline, Iranian shoot down of the airline was so similar. Like the panic button's going off. There's uncertainty going on.
I remember I had some people that I knew, not military people, who, when the Iranians shot down that airliner, they were kind of being like, "Oh, something like that doesn't happen by mistake." I'm like, "No, it totally happens by mistake." Yeah. Very, very easy. You don't know who's running that thing. They've never been in combat before. That the person running that air defense battery has never been in combat. They've never had a situation where it counted. And, they're in a situation where they're probably expecting to be targeted.
You're all spun up. You're waiting to get attacked by the Americans. And all of a sudden, you and I can picture this. You better than me, because you were in the in the Combat Information Center. Is that it? Yeah. What's the CIC?
Yeah, that's it.
So you're in that on a ship, and there's all of a sudden, someone's going, "Hey, all right, we're tracking an inbound," and there's that spin up of the voice, and now you got to make a decision. You got to make a decision of what we're going to do. We see something on the radar. We're looking at it. We know we're vulnerable to attack right now. We're anticipating attack. Oh, where's it heading? We're tracking it. Oh, guess where it's heading for us. All right. Hey, we need to take this thing out. This is a missile. This is an attack. Boom. This could so easily happen. It's ridiculous, actually, how easy it could happen.
In 87, when the Stark got hit by an Iraqi cruise missile, two cruise missiles, I think, the TAO, Tactical Action Officer, and the commanding officer, they got disciplined for failing to defend their ship. And I got to imagine, they're sitting there like, is this really happening right now? If I hit fire, am I going to kill a bunch of civilians? Like, that's a worrying thing, and it's got to be a tough. I've never had to make any decision like that, obviously, and it's a tough one. Especially if you're panicking. I have to imagine that night when the Iranians launched those missiles at us a few months ago. they must have just been sitting on pins and needles.
Bracing for impact.
Especially with Trump. You don't know what that guy's going to do. And if he does respond, it's going to be overwhelming.
Yep.
And they had to have been bracing for impact. I mean, they called ahead and everything supposedly, but I mean, golly, you just don't know. And
the Vincennes had similar like spin-ups going into that shoot down as well, where that wasn't a, again, I'm not saying, not making excuses, but sitting here, and I can understand how that unfolds. I always bring up the fact that in Ramadi there was blue on blue, there was Humvees that shot at other Humvees.
Yeah.
So think about that. Like Humvee, one of the most recognizable vehicles ever made, which is solely used by the U.S. military. And I guess we had Iraqis using it at that point as well. But the enemy was not driving around in Humvees. Years later, ISIS was driving around in Humvees. But at that time, there was no one driving around in Humvees. No enemy.
Yeah.
And a young guy, paranoid and freaked out and scared and, sees a muzzle flash or sees whatever, and I'm going to engage. That's what happens. It's horrible.
Knowing that, if you fail to act, then the next second you might be dead, and you just got to do it, and it's the wrong decision. But and when you're dealing with something like air defense, you're not looking at an aircraft up there. You're looking at a blip on a radar screen, at an aircraft that's out of visual range. And so Saddam, we're talking about Saddam. This guy comes into power in 1979, starts executing people, starts terrorizing the population, immediately goes to war with Iran, has an 8-year-long war. It's the bloodiest war of the second half of the 20th century. Just a brutal, horrible war that's fought with incredibly brutal tactics. That ends in late 1988, and you would think that like maybe Saddam would want to kind of take a breather, but it's not what this guy's about.
And it was kind of a draw.
Yes, it came to a draw, basically. Yeah, neither side achieved any any gains through it. Saddam was the one who launched the war, and he didn't achieve any gains, so you could say he lost on that count. That's late 1988. By early 1989, Saddam is already telling Kuwait. So a lot of the other Arab countries were worried about Iran too. So they were financing Saddam. They were loaning him money, things like that. And already by early 1989, Saddam is telling Kuwait, hey, you're going to have to forgive that debt because we were defending you too, and we're not paying that $65 billion. And Kuwait's not willing to do that. They say that we're not going to do it. Saddam's like, oh, you're going to do it. And by the next summer of 1990, he's invading Kuwait. So no rest for the weary, right? And he does it in an unpredictable way. I remember seeing an interview with Mubarak, the Egyptian president at the time, longtime Egyptian president. And we were allies with Mubarak. We knew him well. And he was not just allies with, he was friends with Saddam Hussein by this point. He knew him. They would talk on the phone. And he called Saddam on the phone. And he says, what's going on here? Are you going to invade Kuwait? And Saddam tells him, no, I'm just bluffing. Just don't worry about it. It's totally fine. The next day, he invades Kuwait. So actually, here's what happened. There's something else in there. Is Mubarak comes and tells us that. He says, hey, he's bluffing. Don't worry about it. And so our ambassador at the time gets called in by Saddam, and Saddam wants to feel him out, right? See how we're doing with this whole thing. And our ambassador had just heard from Mubarak, he's bluffing. Don't worry about it. Don't push him. And so he says, Arab on Arab like affairs, that's not really our business. We're not invested in this. And Saddam goes, all right. And the next day he invades Kuwait, right? So Mubarak, nobody had any idea what was going on here. I mean, I don't even know if I read that quote in the last episode that he tells somebody one thing, he tells another person another thing, and then after that he does something completely different that surprises even himself.
Surprises himself.
Yeah. And so maybe it was something like that. I mean, it's not beyond him to just make that decision.
The mentality that you're dealing with. I mean, you go in an 8-year war, and by the way, you're sitting in a place in a country that's got these incredible amount of natural resources. I mean, Saddam Hussein could have lived. I'm going to say live like a king, but like he could have lived, because he did live like a king, but he could have lived like a peaceful king and just had an incredible, an incredible existence.
Especially with Iran right there threatening everybody, we would have been happy to make him the face of the Arab world. We would have been happy to do it.
So that's where you start. That's where you start to really, look, when people are driven to some sadistic, evil pathology in their life because they don't really have a choice. Like you go, oh, I kind of understand that. Imagine, even if you're like, let's say you take power and just to set everyone straight, you murder a bunch of people that you think might rise up against you. And then you look around and now everyone is just totally good to go. They're cheering for you. And you go, you know what? All right. Hey, we're good. I'm going to ride this out. I'm going to take advantage of this. And then maybe you're a little bit crazy and you go, you know what though? I kind of want to be, that guy. So I'm going to start a war with Iran, with my neighbor over here. So you roll into that. You get them, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of your own people killed. You don't get what you want, but you know what? You get it. You finally end up with a truce. Everyone knows that you'll fight if needed. So now maybe you look around and you go, you know what? All right, I've kind of established myself. Everybody knows not to mess with me. I've got billions of dollars worth of oil. I've got security because I've protected my borders. I'm good. I'm going to ride this one out. I'm going to watch Netflix and chill, right? What kind of a person gets through all that and has the opportunity just to to live a good life and says, you know what, man, Kuwait looks pretty tasty. That's a really, and I guess you could make the same, argument with Hitler, right? How much is enough? And how much is enough? You're storming into Czechoslovakia, you're storming into Poland, you've got these great resources now. You know what? Russia, England, I'm going. That's like a different mentality.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And after Kuwait's military stands down because they have no chance against Iraq, that guy now owns over 20% of the world's oil. That guy. Right? That's what we're looking at. And he's massing troops on the Saudi Arabian border, which just down the eastern shore over there is where the vast majority of their oil is. And so that guy's now got this place. And this is right after the Cold War, right? The Soviet Union's still around in 1990, but the wall fell in 89, and America's kind of the big dog now, and everybody knows that. And George H.W. Bush is president, and he says this is kind of an opportunity to show the world, what the American-led global order is going to be like. And one of the things we got to remember about this, I think this gets twisted up in our heads a little bit now, that the Gulf War was kind of, because it went so well and everything just kind of, because of the way the Iraqi army fell apart, we were not sure about that going in.
Yeah, for sure. So Seaman Recruit Willink joined the Navy, shipped out September 13th, 1990. So, we hadn't started yet, so there was still a lot of unknowns.
Yeah.
And man, I was fired up. And I remember, and I'll have to try and find this at some point in my life, I remember hearing they anticipate 40,000 casualties in the first 48 hours.
Yeah.
And I thought, man, I'm gonna get after it. I was fired up. And I just had a guy on who was there for the push-up. He's in the Marine Corps, and 100% we thought, or the U.S. military, I wasn't there, but the guys that were on the ground there, 100% thought we're going to get, there's going to be chemical, biological attacks. That's what's going to happen. Mop level, they're in and out of their mop level suits all day long, putting the gas masks on, putting them away. I mean, we 100%. And so as soon as you start throwing chemical and biological weapons into this scenario, you're going to lose. You're going to lose a lot of guys. I can't even. It's the strength. Did you ever have to put on mop gear?
Yeah.
Did it not strike you as the saddest excuse for something that's going to save your life?
Yeah.
For instance, on the first of all, it's in two pieces, right? So you've got these pants on. They're not even like a bib that would come up high. They're just pants. Yeah. You put them on over your regular pants. There's a drawstring. There's not a belt. There's a drawstring. So you just pull this thing tight, and then you put a jacket on over your upper body. So there's there's a big gap.
Yeah.
This is going to save you.
Yeah.
Is that what we're saying?
And you got to maneuver in the desert
Yeah,
fight.
and that's all fine. That's all. Like, take all the maneuvering out of it. I'm just saying, if you put me in that suit and you said, okay, I'm going to expose you to chemical weapons now, I'd be like, cool, appreciate it. I got a 20% chance of living, and it's only if I can run away quick enough. I had no faith in those suits. And we had good suits, too. Like, we had the good ones. I had this blower contraption that when you put on your gas mask, it would send positive airflow into your mask, so it was like really nice. So it's very strange.
There were estimates that had the first Marines. The first Marines just rampaged through the Iraqi army
For sure.
when they went up. But there were estimates going in saying they might lose 10 to 15,000 on the first push. There were estimates that said we might lose 1 out of 5 aircraft on the first attack. And so we didn't. The guys who were planning, the military guys, Colin Powell, General Schwarzkopf, these were JOs in Vietnam. And so when we were looking at doing this, we were hesitant at first.
For sure.
It started off with like George Bush was like, we need to make a statement here. But a lot of the military guys were like, I've seen this movie. Like, I want clear political objectives. And more than that, I want overwhelming force.
Yep.
And gladly, that's what Bush gave them. We brought 6 carrier strike groups in there.
Yep.
We brought the 7th Corps down from Europe. We brought the 1st Marines and the Marine Expeditionary Force. We had Arab allies. We had a bunch of it. We came rolling deep.
Well, 300,000, 400,000 troops? What was the number? Do you know the number off the top of your head?
It was over 400,000 when you count the Arab allies and stuff. Yeah. And 6 carrier strike groups. I mean, we hit it hard. And I think that even our own side didn't quite realize how far we had come technologically. Now, Saddam thought there's some lessons learned on both sides that ended up coming back to bite us both in the first Iraq War. Saddam thought this is a technological power. These Americans are technicians. They're not soldiers. And, all of their fancy gears, it can't win a war. And so we hit him hard.
Watch this.
We hit him hard. We drive him out of Kuwait. But when we didn't pursue him, he thought we were afraid to.
Yeah.
He thought we were afraid to go pursue him and fight. And
I got to I guess it must have been like 93, 94. I guess it was 94 when I was in Kuwait, and we were going out to the desert to train, but we went up the highway of death, and like still there was
just littered.
Yeah, there was vehicles, destroyed, and man, you ever heard about the again, now we're talking about it's not just Saddam, but there were maybe you've heard this story. There were places where they had Kuwaiti women 9 months later where they had these orphan kids because so many Kuwaiti women had been raped by Saddam's soldiers that they had these orphans pretty much. Have you heard that?
Yeah. There was no limits. There were all sorts of atrocities they committed in Kuwait while they knew the whole world was watching. That's the crazy part about it. He had a level of arrogance, which led to a lot of bad decision making on Saddam Hussein's part. He thought his military was ready. He thought we were going to, get a bloody nose, if we tried to go after him. And he blamed the loss on his general. He had a bunch of his generals executed afterwards. Sure. He blamed it on his military leadership and on the cowardice of some of the officers who had just let order break down. He did not accept that he had lost that war, and he thought we were afraid to go after him.
And it is kind of strange when you think about it, how quickly they broke down. Because here's what you'd thinking, like, wait, you just got out of an 8-year war with Iran. You are hardened combat soldiers. Yeah, that's very strange. I wouldn't have predicted that. Sometimes I talk about the fact that I don't bet on the UFC. The Ultimate Fighting Championship. I don't bet on the UFC, and the reason why is because there have been, I'll say, about 10 times and I've been following the UFC since it started. There's been about 10 times where I knew I had inside information. Because I'm friends and training partners and training with people that were about to fight. I had inside information where I would have easily said, oh, I'll bet the house. I'll bet I'll bet next year's paychecks that this guy's going to win. And sure enough, I'd lose. I would have lost. And I realized, there's been a couple times where I had good inside information and played out just the way I thought it would. But as Joe Rogan says, it's a fight.
Yeah.
and anything can happen in a fight. So if you were to tell me, and I'm trying not to use the benefit of hindsight, because it's real easy to look back. Oh, of course, we've got the technological power. And even when I threw out that little arrogant quote when you're like, they didn't think they could beat us technically, and I said, watch this. I'm sitting here saying that. If you would have asked me, knowing what I know now, hey, who's going to win, or what kind of scrap is this going to be? You've got 8 years worth of hardened combat veterans on the Iraqi side versus, and by the way, they're fighting in their home like turf, versus these Americans. The last thing we did on a large scale was Vietnam, which we didn't like. Yeah. We didn't like that. And now we're going toe to toe with these guys. That's a much tougher thing to think about. And yeah, I mean, we think about the generals at this time. All those generals, vast majority of these generals were Vietnam guys that were looking at this thing going, okay, I'll go, but we better hit them with overwhelming force. But yeah, I've never really thought that deeply about it. The fact that this was not a given. And it ended up, the fact that it was so easy, which is exactly what it was. And I'm curious, I mean, the Iraqi soldiers just fell apart and ran. Yeah. It was like, it's kind of crazy to think about. Why didn't you fall apart and run from the Iranians?
Our biggest problem early on in those first few days of the assault became processing all the POWs who were surrendering. We were like, we don't really have the manpower to deal with all these people. I think part of it was that, just in that massive choreographed airstrike at the beginning, we took out all of their air defense, all of their communications, and just everything that linked their military structure together just went dark. And so every little unit that's spread around is now just out there on their own, basically. They got to send runners if they want to talk to somebody. And then the 1st Marines just rampages straight at them.
And to your point, this is centralized command, right? This is not a bunch of, hey, I got cut off from my unit, but I know what the objective is and I'm going to carry it out regardless. That's not the Iraqi army. The Iraqi army is, I'm not doing a damn thing.
I think most Arab armies are like that.
Yeah. I'm not doing a damn thing until I get told exactly what to do, because I'm not going to get.
Even still, it is crazy when you think about the fact that those juniors and generals and colonels and stuff, they knew that if their unit just decided to surrender, that it's going to be bad news for them. And yet that's what happened in mass numbers.
Yeah, it's hard to understand the psychology behind that, actually.
And it taught us we learned some negative lessons from that as well.
Well, yeah, we absolutely learned some negative lessons from that. Although, I don't know, right? I mean, let's face it. The opening salvos of the invasion in 2003 were pretty much the same thing. I mean, pretty much the same thing. There was more resistance, obviously, as we pushed up. I mean, and again, I just had a guy on, Gunny Busser, who was on the push up. Nasiriyah, there was a little hesitation. There was some fighting, but it was vastly massive surrender.
Yeah. I mean, the American military is something that's never been seen before. I mean, and even if you take the technology out of it, when you put just the communications and the coordination, the multi-force coordination, it's crazy to me how I used to play paintball a lot with my friends, and we would go play paintball, and we were all fast, we were athletes, we were like, whatever, and we would go out and play, and we would sometimes run into these fat old guys who had been playing together for a long time, who just knew how to move. They knew how to work together, cover and move, and all that kind of stuff, and they would just butcher us. And it's insane how much of a difference just knowing what you're doing really makes. And how many times do you read about Ranger unit in Afghanistan ambushed by the Taliban? One Ranger wounded, 32 Taliban killed, 52 captured. And it's like, wait, I get that we have stealth bombers and satellites and all that, but this is still just dudes with guns, right? It's like, well, yeah and no. I mean, the American military is a buzzsaw that you just, feed human beings into when it gets worked up. And but I think what I meant was it kind of gave us this lesson that, man, not only is war easy, it's politically uniting. You remember back in the early 90s, there was that music video, Voices That Care. It was like every huge celebrity, the biggest people, I mean, it was Bono and Will Smith and
I actually don't remember this at all.
Oh, it would be the equivalent of today of like Katy Perry and Taylor Swift.
What was it? Like a music video, pro troops or something?
Yeah, it was just Sing to the Troops, Voices That Care. We're thinking about you while you're over there. Something you could not imagine seeing today. It's just a different environment.
I was probably in boot camp or something because I do not remember that at all.
You got to watch it just for the different times. Because today it would be hard to imagine anything like that, and especially from that class of people. And it was politically unifying. You know, it was kind of, we didn't lose much of anybody. You know, we behaved ourselves very, very honorably.
Yeah.
You know.
Yes, you are. Then I accept your assessment that some bad lessons were learned. Not so much about. Yeah, we learned the lesson that this was going to be easy.
And then Kosovo reinforced that.
Yeah, Kosovo reinforced that, and all those people that said you need boots on the ground in order to really affect change. Well, we went to Kosovo and no boots on the ground.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you look up and you go, well.
There were also intelligence lessons that all the military guys who were hesitant at first. You had a lot of the civilian leadership who was looking at them like they were just kind of too cautious, and a little too scared, a little too shocked by Vietnam, and those experiences. So that when we got up to 2003, you had a lot of the military side saying, look, this is not enough people to secure this country. We need 300,000. We need 400,000 people. We need this. We need that. And, a lot of these same guys in the Bush administration were the same guys in lower level, mid-level positions in the first Bush administration. They're like, wait, I've heard this before from you people. In fact, Colin Powell, who's Secretary of State now, who's the one who's telling us to be very, very careful here if we're going to go into Iraq, I've heard this from you before. You were cautious in the first Gulf War as well. And so, there was a little bit of distrust between the civilian and military leadership that came in.
That's really, really disturbing. But it's such it's like as you talk about it, it's just like, oh yeah, I mean, I see this all the time, right? I see this all the time from businesses, from leaders that they don't have a good enough relationship. They don't communicate to each other properly. They don't explain things in a way that could be clear. And instead of explaining, they just get mad and they say, I'm telling you, you got to trust me. And like that's all that is. It's awful. It's awful.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think that the intelligence side as well, our intelligence did not see the invasion of Kuwait coming. It caught us off guard. And so, some of the civilian leadership lost trust with the intelligence community there. When 9/11 surprised us again, a lot of those same people come to distrust, some of the intelligence establishment even more. And it was a little bit of a toxic relationship by the time you got to 2003 between, the brass at the DOD and some of these other places and the actual military leadership and the intelligence community leadership. That I think, we'll get into that in then maybe the next episode or so, that, there were some breakdowns in communication at the leadership level that ended up filtering down to you guys on the ground, and that's what I'm kind of interested in hearing about.
Is there anything else to wrap up kind of pre like escalation of tensions leading into the invasion in 2003?
I think we can probably talk a little bit about it in the next episode. We'll talk about how we kind of started that ball rolling after 9/11. And I want to talk a little bit about what Iraq was up to in the 90s as well, and how we were dealing with them, and how it had become this kind of festering sore that we did not have a good solution for. That it was just sitting there because of the oil for food program and because of the way the sanctions were being cheated by a lot of countries in the most corrupt and ugliest ways. Just Saddam's regime is, letting a lot of these countries, just full corruption, take cuts from like the oil for food sales, and then they're feeding billions of dollars back to Saddam's regime. Ugly stuff by people who are supposed to be our allies. And so, it creates a situation where you have this regime who's ruling through brutality and terror, who's not going anywhere. The sanctions are not going to work. And children are dying of starvation in the streets because of the sanctions. So a lot of people are starting to say, we can't keep this up. We can't just keep starving this population. Well, okay, what are you going to do? You're going to say, oh, Saddam, you got us. All those UN resolutions, none of that means it. You won. You outlasted us. You outlasted the global community, right? The global order with all of these institutions behind it. You beat us. You outlasted us because you were willing to inflict such suffering on your own people, to watch them starve while you and your regime took all the money that you were getting and used it to control them. And we just can't take watching this anymore. So, we're just going to lift all this and you admit you won and create that precedent for other people like you going forward. Or, in a post 9/11 world, we can go in there and do something about it. And that was really, the second Iraq war, if you want to put it that way, is a lot of people, and I think history will bear this out. It wasn't a second war. There were two ground fights, two moments of acute combat in one long war with Saddam Hussein's regime. Mm-hmm. We were launching airstrikes at him all through the 1990s. In 1993, he tried to assassinate George H.W. Bush. This is after he's not even president anymore, and he was visiting Kuwait, and Saddam sent a hit team over there to try to assassinate him, a former American president. And so this guy is not cowed. He is still causing problems for us. And meanwhile, Iran is growing and becoming more dangerous, and we need a functional Iraq. If you look at a map of the Middle East, it is just right there in the middle of everything, and we need it to be somewhat functional, but we can't help it be functional as long as this guy's in control, because we can't build him up. And so what do? And people are going to be debating, long after we get done with this, what the right thing to do there was, but I think people oversimplify what our options were.
Yeah. And again, it's, two things. One thing I want to correct is I said that a guy that I had on the podcast was in the first Gulf War, and I was, in my mind I was thinking, but no, he was on the push-up, but he had guys that had been in the first Gulf War that kind of, they helped them along. And then I'm thinking about this, and again, I just to frame this up, some people say that I'm like a driven person, right?
No.
And I am. I want to do things, and I want to, when somebody says, what's your goal? I'll be like, take over the world, right? Fun. Like, yeah, there's a hint of truth in there because I want to go out and make things happen, but I'm not looking to take over the world in a literal sense. And then you think about Saddam, and you like. So I'm thinking about it from my perspective as you're talking through all this stuff. I'm thinking, I like to, as I was reflecting back on what I told you earlier, is like, hey, aren't you good? Like, you've got a country you've taken over. You got billions of dollars worth of assets. You fought a long war. Like, even me, I think I'd look around and be like, all right, you know what? I'll go ahead and we'll just call this success. I've got my own nation. I've got billions of dollars. I'll call it good. But it's not good enough.
There is one thing that we did leave out. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but is that after the war is over, on his way out of spite, he lights up all the Kuwaiti oil wells just to blacken the sky. Creates the biggest oil spill in human history by opening up the valves in Kuwait and sending it out into the Persian Gulf. And then, and this is really where you got a lot of people who were, after 9/11, really, really, really looking for Saddam's throat in the United States, is we had told the people of Iraq, meaning sort of the Shia population in the south, the Kurds in the north, rise up against Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, that's right.
We thought that he would be overthrown in kind of a natural way. We were also talking to his generals and whoever else, but that wasn't going to happen. The Sunni population wasn't going to turn on him to hand over control to the Shiites. That's not going to happen. So we're talking to the Shia population in the south, the Kurds in the north, rise up against Saddam, and they do. And we just watch from across the border as he annihilates them, kills. We don't actually know, maybe 180,000 people all told, but for sure 100,000, and we are right across the border in Kuwait, easily with the ability to stop it from happening to the Shiites. He drives, scores of thousands of Kurds, this is what you were reading about earlier, up into the mountains. This is in January and February. They're going to freeze to death. They're going to starve to death. He's massacring these people using women and children as human shields as he goes into their villages, using them as hostages, saying, I'm going to kill these women and children. If the men don't stay put, they stay put. He massacres all the men. And so all of these Kurds flee up into the mountains. And we have junior, State Department, Defense Department officials at the time, guys like Paul Wolfowitz, who would be Donald Rumsfeld's deputy by the time we get to 2003, who were like, if I get another crack at this guy, I am taking him out. And because they felt like we betrayed those people, and we did. And of course, we went in to help the Kurds afterwards, as they were getting pushed out. Operation Provide Comfort, we start dropping supplies to them, and it starts out as that, but then we're like, well, what are we going to do with these people? And Turkey's like, you're not keeping Kurds here, right? And so we're like, well, people were worried that if we set them up in like in a refugee camp somewhere, that it would turn into another Palestinian situation. So finally we were like, let's just push the Iraqi army back far enough so that these people can go back to their homes. And so we did that, and the Kurds moved in back to their homes, and we were like, well, now we kind of inherited the responsibility to protect these people, and we did that, and it was awesome.
Was it Southern Watch? That was Operation Southern Watch?
Yeah, and I don't remember, actually. I don't remember. I thought it was a part of Provide Comfort.
It might have been Provide
Comfort and Provide Comfort 2. And it was amazing. It worked perfectly. Like, the Kurds created one of the best places in the Middle East besides Israel. I mean, just a great place up there in Erbil, considering the neighborhood. And that was another lesson that we took, that like, oh, okay, if we can just go in there and get rid of the bad people, then the good people can come in and just build up a nice little society here.
It's that idea of if we can just tip the scales, right? If we can just tip the scales. And I don't know where I originally heard this from, but it was somebody that had direct relations with Cuba, like someone that was Cuban or parents were Cuban and had been passed down this lore, which was when all the Cubans in America were saying, hey, look, all we need to do is start this thing off, and the Cubans will rebel against Fidel Castro and will free Cuba. And, the story was, it was like all the Cubans that were saying that, and it was a lot of Cubans that were saying that, all of them that were saying that were in America. And so they're saying, yeah, don't worry. And as soon as they got down there, the Cubans that were in Cuba were like, what are you doing? No, this is Cuba. We don't want you here. And it's not quite the same situation, but the idea that you can tip the scales, the idea that just going to take a little bit to tip the scales is the feeling that you get when you're on the outside looking in, and it looks like, hey, if we just apply enough pressure here, they can rise up against them.
And yet, that is all true. And yet, I think that, and we'll get into this, we'll talk about some of those bad decisions we started to talk about in the last episode, that when we went in 2003, that was a winnable fight. And it was winnable early, I think. I really do. I think it was something that it would have taken a long time. It would have taken some dedication as far as timeline went, some presence. But I think that what that war turned into had a lot to do with decisions that we made once we were there.
There's no doubt about it. And I guess we can get into those decisions in that war next time. So if you want to support this podcast, you can check out our other podcasts. I have Jocko podcast, the Warrior Kid podcast, and the Grounded podcast. And Daryl's got a podcast called Murder Made. And if you want to support all these podcasts, then one thing you can do to help out is go and get some gear from jockostore.com or get some gear from originmaine.com. Got all kinds of stuff on there. Thanks for listening as things unravel. This is Jocko and Daryl. Out.